Douglas, thank you very much indeed for that warm welcome. And it's a great, great pleasure to be once again in the Art Institute and in Chicago. This is where we are. And I want to start really by thanking Douglas for enabling the latest cooperation between the Art Institute and the British Museum in the loan of the Byzantine and late Roman material, which is going to be in the new Jaharis galleries. I've just had a chance to look at it, and I must say those objects look far, far more beautiful here than they ever have in London. They have traveled extremely well. And it's pleasing that it's the latest link in a long friendship between the two institutions, a link that's embodied in the person of Bonnie Greer, one of our trustees, the writer and the broadcaster, who is, of course, a native of Chicago. And this is a very fuzzy slide, but I don't need to apologize for that too much because she's coming in person tomorrow for the opening of the Harris Gallery, and you'll be able to see her in focus. The British Museum, as Douglas said, was set up in the 1750s by Parliament to enable citizens to think about the world. London at that point was the first city in history, really, to be able to be in regular contact with the whole world, thanks to the development of shipping. And Parliament decided that if you're going to trade with the world, you need to understand the world. And so they created a building. This is the latest manifestation of it, in which the whole world would be gathered under one roof. And from the beginning, the great excitement, the great area of curiosity and ignorance and confusion was, of course, the Americas. I said, no, don't misunderstand. People had always known that China was there and Japan was there, and they knew roughly what went on there, even though there was more contact than before. But the world of America had become, of course, a world of very particular fascination. And for 400 years, the understanding of the Americas has been one of the prime preoccupations of the British. And what I want to do this evening is really to try to show you from some of the things in the museum how we've been able to think, to understand, or to misunderstand this continent. What you're looking at is really the beginning of that relationship. It's a map from John White's record of the first attempt to establish a British settlement in America in Roanoke in the 1590s. And this is, it says it's Virginia Pars. It failed dismally. Everybody died, and it didn't work out at all as expected. But we didn't know that when John White made his maps and made his first record of this new part of the world that fascinated everybody. Those wonderful words from Donne, remember talking to his mistress when he calls it, "Oh, my America, my newfound land." The great words in The Tempest, "Oh, brave new world that has such people in it." America becomes the fantasy of everything desirable, good, because according to John White, you were a very jolly lot. This is the first image made by a European of a Native American in the 1590s. And it was in the British Museum when it opened in 1759. The flower, as you can see, is dancing. And of course, what's fascinating is that already you can see that we can only ever see a foreign culture through the conventions and the assumptions of our own. This Native American dancer is, in fact, like a Jambalaya bronze, or indeed like someone at a court masque from the reign of Elizabeth. And these Native Americans had beautiful, tidy, well-organized, prosperous, and fertile villages, because the point of all this was to encourage English people to come and live in America. And so John White presents the Native American settlements, really making it all look rather like Hampshire. And a place where you would very much like to come and farm. And again, these very friendly natives doing what natives always seem to do, which is dancing. usually high on something. He's called the flyer, as you can see top right. But it is one of the constants of the view of America that you would get from the objects in the British Museum, going right through to the 1940s, where you feel very little has changed. People high on something, obviously having a wonderful time. This is one aspect of why America was so appealing. It later emerged that, of course, there was a particular devotion to games, and this was equally exotic and thrilling, taking indeed a very peculiar form. This is in the British Museum, and this is in the Art Institute. And as many of you will know, they are made of serpentine. They're extremely heavy. They weigh about 90 pounds. And they are, in some sense, belts that you wore in the ball game in Mexico. And we don't quite know whether they were actually worn. I mean, obviously, if you're carrying a stone belt of 90 pounds, it's quite difficult to skip around the court. So it may have been a ritual beforehand, maybe in some kind of ceremonial act. But we know that these are part of the great ball game ritual from Mexico, where teams of 2 to 7 people had to keep the ball in the air and land it to the opponent's end of the court. And as you know, great ball courts were set up to allow great crowds. But some of the first sports stadia, really, in the world were somewhere around 700 AD. And these are wonderful pieces of sculpture, of course. But what fascinated people was not so much the carving, but the game behind them. Because the Spaniards were absolutely fascinated by this game. It is about keeping the ball in the air and pushing it to the other side of the court. But the rules are that you can't use either your head or your hands or your feet. What you can use are your hips. And the Spaniards were so fascinated by this, they brought 2 Aztecs to Europe to show the astonished European public what Americans got up to. Now, it may be that this is part of the belt of which our stone belts are somehow ceremonial versions. But these 2 ball players toured Europe. This is a 1528 German image of it. And you can see it must have been a fairly painful game. You could only use your forearms or your thighs or indeed your buttocks, which are clearly highly developed in the process. And no less astonishing than the rules of the game and the way it was played was the fact that the ball was rubber. The first time Europeans had ever seen a rubber ball. And the Spanish writer Diego Duran says they call the material of this ball hule, rubber. It is a jumping and bouncing object. It moves upwards and downwards, to and fro. And it can exhaust the pursuer running to catch up with it. It is it must have been an amazing thing for the Europeans to see. They're also quite heavy. They weigh anywhere between 8 pounds and 30 pounds, the balls. It's a very energetic game. And we know that the Aztecs sometimes exacted tribute of 16,000 rubber balls. It was the first strange American game of which physical evidence reached Europe. But of course, American football still leaves us all completely bewildered. The things you get up to with ball sports when you could perfectly properly play soccer or cricket does cause amazement in our attempts to understand. But not only is it dancing and music, not only is it games, but also, of course, the great achievement of the Americas for the first Europeans was the invention of smoking. This is one of we've got a rather interesting collection. You have much bigger ones of these stone pipes from Mound City in Ohio. And as you know, you put the tobacco in here, and you smoke it from here. So as you smoke it, you are absolutely eye to eye with the otter. And as it is Nicotiana rustica, which is particularly hallucinogenic, you and your otter presumably have quite a trip. This, as you know, became the great excitement for Europe. Tobacco, Bremen and Glasgow, Bristol and Le Havre make their fortunes on American tobacco. And it is, of course, from America that this great pleasure swept the world. And one of the interesting things we have in the British Museum to show this is an amazing collection of American cigarette cards. A very generous benefactor left us 800,000 of these. So when Douglas said, we rather boastfully say somewhere around 8 million objects in our collection, we don't tend to underline the fact that 800,000 of them are actually cigarette cards. But what you're looking at is not just any cigarette card. You are looking at the most valuable cigarette card in the world. And for a very, if I may say, American reason. Because in the 1920s, 30s, the great day of the cigarette cards, you collected sets of sportsmen or whatever. The great hero of ball games in America was Mr. Wagner from Pittsburgh. And Mr. Wagner decided at a moment of conversion that he would not only abandon tobacco, but try to persuade the world to stop smoking, somewhat ahead of his time. And he therefore bought up and paid people to buy up every known example of the cigarette card with himself on it, likely to lead the young into error. And only 2 versions are known. One of them is in the BM. So if you spot this in an attic, it is worth hanging on to. But it is, of course, from our point of view, another of the extraordinary fascinations of America, that these great pleasures are invented and then prohibited. And it's quite startling, even today, when I signed into the university club. In Europe, it's normally enough to be told the room is no smoking. But I had to sign a statement that I would agree to pay a $250 fine if I smoked in my room. So Mr. Wagner lives. And so from the things that you can see in the British Museum, the inhabitants of America are clearly worth thinking about very carefully. How did you come to be here? How did people get to America? And of course here the story is the same as everybody. The American story begins, like everybody else's, in East Africa, here in the Rift Valley, where people like us first began making the tools that would allow us ultimately to control the world. These beautiful hand axes, which have a point that you can prod, kill, stab with, and edges that you can strip bark or hide or whatever. This is the only technology that has ever really mattered in the whole of humanity. And for 99% of humanity's existence, this was technology. And you can see what a beautifully made thing it is. This is about 1.2 million years old. It would fit exactly into your hand, and it is, as you can see, also a very beautiful bit of sculpture. And it tells us, I think very interesting, that even at this date, 1.2 million years ago, our ancestors were conceptually able to imagine the shape inside the stone which they were releasing. And the symmetry, which is no real advantage to the tool, is clearly an aesthetic decision and brilliantly and carefully exercised. This is what lets us move from East Africa round the world. And on the whole, when you leave Africa, it's much easier to turn right. As you can imagine, the Atlantic, as you know, is a particularly disobliging ocean in terms of its winds. You can't go backwards and forwards easily. quite unlike the Indian Ocean, which you can go round and round happily. So almost everybody, when they moved from Central Africa, go south, northwest, or into Eurasia, and spread right over the whole world. So that by about 40,000 years ago, there are humans all over Africa, Eurasia, and Australia, but not in America. And then, as you know, then comes climate change, ice age, and huge amounts of ice take up the water. And for the people who had got from here to here, and they'd got here certainly by about 15,000 years ago in eastern Siberia, what happens is that the Bering Strait, of course, the sea recedes, the water levels fall, and you can walk on pasture from eastern Siberia into North America. And I think even then, people must have thought that if you were in eastern Siberia, it would be quite a good idea to walk to America. And we imagine that what happened was that the reindeer and the bison that they were living off and hunting moved over, and they followed. And so people get to America. And what then happens is that the hand axe, which has remained virtually the same, we get hand axes of this shape all around the world. It's clearly an inherited technology that hardly moves, but it does change, of course, when we get to America, because the hand axe is refined into this wonderful thing. It's about the size of an Apple iPhone, and it's just as beautifully designed. Just as beautifully designed. And it's, as many of you will know, they're called Clovis points. The first one was found in Clovis, New Mexico in 1936, and they are spear points which were used by those people moving from Asia into America. And I think it's now generally agreed that this is what happened. And these are found from California to Florida and from Alaska to Mexico. What is fascinating about this is that it is, of course, like the other hand axe, most beautifully made and shaped. These beautiful ridges are very carefully calculated and organized. It is, again, a beautiful bit of sculpture, but it is, as you can see, derived from the hand axe, but it is also, of course, a weapon of mass destruction, because those ripples do something very, very interesting if you hit a mammoth. This is your main aim in life, of course, is to kill the large mammals, which are very, very prevalent across the American continent. You need to be a very, very good shot to get a mammoth either in the eye or through the heart or whatever. But if you wound it with a rippled blade, it will bleed and bleed. So you don't need to be that good a shot. If you use this kind of weapon, you can be sure that you'll get your prey. And they do. And as you know, all the large mammals are exterminated after the arrival of human beings using this kind of technology. This is a story that repeats all around the world in different ways, but on the whole, the arrival of humans is not good news for the local animals, as many found in New Zealand and Mauritius, where the dodo was. That's the long ago history, because what happened, of course, after the cross into Alaska was climate change, global warming, the seas rose, and America was cut off. And for the next 15,000 years, effectively, those people who come from Asia develop their own civilizations from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. And it's not until, as you know, the 15th, 16th century that for the Europeans, America appears. And this is one of the objects in the museum that makes, I think, a very interesting point about what that meant. It's the medal produced in 1590 to celebrate Sir Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the world. It's a little silver disc. It's about that size, very thin, and I hope you can see the dotted lines which show how Drake sailed. He starts from Plymouth. He goes down to the bottom of South America, and then turns. He discovers that Tierra del Fuego doesn't link with Antarctica, and comes into the Pacific. And in the Pacific, somewhere off Peru, he manages to capture a Spanish silver fleet and steals the treasure. He then goes on over the Pacific to the Dutch East Indies, what would become later the Dutch East Indies, Spice Islands, then Portuguese-controlled, spends the money, the silver that he's stolen from the Spaniards, the Spice Islands, comes home round the Cape of Good Hope, and comes back to England so rich because of selling the spices that the Queen, who was a major investor in the whole enterprise, doubles her income in the year. And he makes the medals out of the remaining bits of stolen Spanish silver. Just to make the point that it is now, there are only 2 countries in the world that have circumnavigated. 2 ships have done it. One was Spanish, and the second one is Drake, is English. It's a moment of wild national pride and absurd arrogance. You can see that the below America, written in large letters, is Nova Albion, New Britain. Completely ridiculous. I mean, nobody had ever been in that bit of America at all. And you'll notice that much further down, can't see it very easily from here, but around there, I think you can see it's written in tiny letters, Hispania, as though it was a small cattle ranch in Texas. This is the world as the English wanted to see it. And it was the world that they were going to explore, find out about, and make a lot of money out of. It becomes a great fact of pride and excitement that this is what the British have done, the English have done. And this is why, of course, when Shakespeare has to decide what he's going to call his theatre, he calls it the globe. It is the world, and the world that the English have sailed round. And there's something both fascinating and disturbing about that use of the word. And interestingly, German tourists to London, there's a lot of theatre going on in the 1590s. A German tourist, he writes, Thomas Platter, that the English go to the theatre in order to find out about the rest of the world. That's where they see what happens elsewhere. The globe, this is very much a public, a community thinking about this brave new world that hath such people in it and wanting to know more about it. The reality was, of course, that this brave new world was almost entirely Spanish. And the story of America was, I think it's fair to say, until well into the 20th century, totally dominated by the story told about it by the Spaniards. I show you a typical example of the kind of presentation of the dialogue between Cortes and Moctezuma. And as always, of course, it's the victors who write the history, particularly when only the victors can write. And this is where museums become so important, because it's the things that can tell the story from the other side, and only the things. And this, I think, is one of our key tasks in museums, to let the things tell the stories of the defeated, to give a voice to those who, in history, were on the losing side. And what things the Aztecs had. I mean, this, as you can see, is a double-headed serpent. It's about that size, so it's a big thing, possibly worn round the neck, and it's made of about 2,000 separate pieces of turquoise with white shell and red shell. It is, in itself, I think, the document that tells us an enormous amount about the Aztec Empire, the way they saw it and the way they thought about it. It is, as you can see, in the shape of a serpent, and as you can see, the turquoise dances in the light so that it looks like feathers. We're almost certainly looking at the feathered snake god, Quetzalcoatl. We're almost certainly looking at that emblem, therefore, of the earth and heaven combined, the snake and the bird. And the more you look, the more extraordinary this becomes, because we can now identify very clearly the source of turquoise. It has a very distinct mineralogical signature. And we know that among those 2,000 pieces in this serpent are pieces that come from over 1,000 miles apart, collected from the various points of the Aztec Empire and gathered in Tenochtitlan and made into one. It is a physical demonstration of the range and the scale and the diversity of the Aztec Empire. Gathered as tribute, we know that this is a later record of the kind of tributes that the Aztecs exacted from their subject peoples. And gold, slaves, turquoise, animals, whatever. And everything gathered in Tenochtitlan and turned into the sort of objects that had great ceremonial significance. The object itself, the snake, just let me go back to the snake, is therefore evidence of that whole system of tribute tribes forced to render valuable things and valuable services. And the extent of the value is really great. As you saw the map and the range of places, the red elements, the gums and the snout of the serpents, are from thorny oyster. It's the shell of thorny oyster, very, very deep-lying oyster, very difficult and dangerous to gather and to collect, hugely valuable, also must have been surrendered as tribute, and from both coasts of Mexico. And this object is held together by a kind of gum, which is itself very unusual. It's not the normal resin gum that is readily available. It's a particular Bersera resin with a very sweet smell, used above all by the Aztecs for incense. So the glue that holds this object together is part of the ritual of worship and of devotion to the gods. It's a marvelous example of an empire which combines in its theology heaven and earth, power and faith, and combining the uncombinable, suspending the whole thing in the resin that is incense of worship. It is, I think, a document of what that empire was, and you have a very similar kind of piece in the Art Institute, again of turquoise and shell, and good example of the fact that this is a military empire exacting tribute, forcing tribute, and the Aztecs needing alliances. This disc is, you see the two crossed darts, is this memorial of an alliance, a treaty, it's effectively a treaty, a mark of a treaty of alliance in 1456, we know from the date. And it shows how necessary it was to keep these military alliances going, to keep the empire on the road. And the alliance is sealed. This is the remnants of a dead body, which is, I think, the equivalent of a handshake in the Aztec Empire, some ritual sacrifice, and then you know that the deal is safe. You've got an alliance. And, of course, this is, I think, what is so interesting about these turquoise shell objects, because they in themselves tell you why the Aztec Empire was so fragile. It was a recent empire, and because the tribute was so vigorously demanded, there were always rebellions, always wars, and so when the Spaniards arrived, they could count on a great deal of local help to keep them going. Local help, you can see, was necessary from the objects themselves. The Spanish, of course, played down this side because they wanted to present their victory as their extraordinary achievement. without realizing that really what happens is they precipitate a civil war, and it's a civil war in which an outsider wins. The Spanish preferred to argue that Moctezuma was deeply superstitious. Again, the kind of propaganda that was put out for centuries of the other side, and that they had believed that Cortes was, in fact, the incarnation of Quetzalcoatl, the serpent, feathered serpent god. A legend that Quetzalcoatl would arrive as a fair-skinned, bearded man was said to have been one of the reasons why Moctezuma didn't fight, but offered him tribute. And we know that when he did offer him tribute, he offered him a serpent wand inlaid with turquoise. That's the Spanish note. Could it be that double-headed serpent? Well, we would like to think it is, but there's no evidence. But it does, of course, it becomes a very strong element of the assumption about the Americas that they're so prone to worrying about prophecies and superstitions. This is a Spanish account showing Moctezuma worrying about the comet that he thought was going to predict bad luck, another evidence of his superstition. This is, I say, one of the interesting areas where the things can counter the written sources, complete them, let us see what it was like from the other side. We can do it better from Mexico than anywhere else because we have so much information. It was such an evolved empire, and of course it was the empire which the Spaniards themselves met. It's much, much harder with South America, and particularly with the civilizations of Peru. And here, we're, I think, in an area where archaeology can take us so far, and then we're into speculation, we're into poetic imagining, where everybody has to make their own story of what really was going on. In Peru, that narrow coastal strip between the Andes and the ocean, which is fertile, where there's all the fish, where you can have high populations living in quite dense areas. The Mochi civilization, which was exactly the same time as the Roman Empire, has left, above all, as you know, only really ceramic objects. And above all, these kinds of jars, pots. This is the British Museum one. This is your one. There are thousands of these. And they are a kind of ceramic horror movie. These crouching figures poised to attack and looking fierce. They're nearly all found in graves. And we know that in one grave, there were found 75 male bodies which had been clearly ritually slaughtered, been cut, some had been flayed, and found with those bodies was a club that still had human blood on it. What is going on in the Mochi Empire? It's about the size of Portugal. It's very densely populated, much more densely populated than today, advanced irrigation. But these objects, all we can do is speculate. In Europe, at the same date, we have the songs like Beowulf, we have the legends, the tales of fighting. We don't have that at all for the Mochi. You have to look at these objects and make your own story. And later on for the Paracas people, the same kind of date around the turn of the millennium, around 100 AD, around BC 200 AD. What above all survives is textiles. These small, alarming figures flying with weapons, sometimes carrying felines. These are the British Museum ones. All we have are these little cutout figures. You have this astonishing textile, all of them together, a great procession of these objects. And what we can say, of course, is what you need to produce this kind of textile. The number of animals. This is some kind of llama, and then it's woven and it's embroidered. And this is a very large textile used to wrap the dead. And particularly interesting, of course, because, as you know, textile is what doesn't survive. Most civilizations, we've lost all our textiles. Only 2 civilizations have really come through as great textiles cultures, Egypt and Peru, for exactly the same reason, that of course their climate allows it to survive. This is one of the great documents of a civilization which, again, we have no way of knowing what is going on in these frightening creatures. I mean, clearly supernatural, clearly connected with death, and clearly the result of a highly structured social organization. These, I think, are some of the most exciting developments, really, of 20th century history. The attempt to recover the non-literary cultures of South America. And they produce some wonderful small objects, particularly, of course, from the Incas. And I just want to show them this really, because I think this is one of the most beautiful little bits of sculpture we have in the BM. It could sit on the palm of your hand. It's only a couple of inches high, and is this wonderful, beguiling little gold llama. And the significance of him is, of course, twofold. Firstly, if you're trying to run the Inca Empire, and you have the coastal strip, and then the terraces just above it, and then the plateaus at 12,000 feet, the only way you can do this is with the llama. The llama is what makes the Inca Empire possible. And the Inca Empire at the time, and it's, again, we're about 1400, 1500, is, I think it's fair to say, the largest empire in the world. It's much larger than Ming China, much larger than Ottoman Turkey. And it has no proper roads in the sense that we would understand them. And they have only one animal that's any use, which is the llama. And it's not that much use. It can only carry 60 pounds, although that is more than you're allowed in business class in American Airways. But you can't actually ride it. And yet, this amazing empire is held together. And we know that gold llamas were offered in sacrifice at various points because gold, called the sweat of the sun by the Incas, is, of course, the divine element. What turquoise is in Mexico, gold is in Peru. And this, of course, is why the Spaniards came, and this is why this kind of object is so rare, because the great bulk of these objects were melted down into ingots by the Spaniards. It also makes one, I think, rather poignant point, a very important point, which is about the luck of the draw in the animals that you wind up with. All our civilizations depend on the plants we have and the animals we get. And for Eurasia, lucky enough to have the horse and the cow and the donkey and the dog and the pig, you just need to get them somewhere and they can move across and be developed, moved, whatever. Australia, I think, got the worst hand of all. It's extremely difficult to domesticate a kangaroo, and you can't really use emus to carry anything. The llama was all right, but of course it was hopeless in front of a Spanish horse. And this little emblem is the emblem of how the Inca Empire worked, why it was sought after, and why ultimately it was conquered. And it's this mixture of the narratives, the mixture of the cultures, that is, of course, particularly fascinating from now on, because the rest of American history is about how those cultures live together, are conflated. And the most eloquent object I know in the British Museum's collection about that process is this map from Mexico, which, a 16th century map showing what happened after the late 16th, early 17th century, after the conquest, and showing in the roads, the straight lines are paths of long in use. The rectangular divisions are fields. And you can see there's a lot of writing on it, mostly in Nahuatl. And you can see people and two buildings. And the two buildings, of course, are churches. This is the church labeled as Santa Barbara. And it's called Santa Barbara Tamasolco. Santa Barbara, the place of the toad. Toads, of course, had a particular quality. They produce hallucinogenic excretion, so like nicotine. They were tied into all kinds of rituals. And the pattern was always the same, that where there was a local cult site, it was demolished, and on the platform, a church was put. And if possible, the church took over something of what was going on before. So the church on the right had been a temple to the local goddess Toci, T-O-C-I, Toci, who was a grandmother goddess. And it therefore, in Christian terms, moves easily into St. Anne, the grandmother of Jesus, and becomes the church of Santa Anna, the one on the right. And this conflation is, I think, visible all the way through. And there's an inscription for the people here in which, in Nahuatl, it says, Juan Bernabe said to his wife, "O sister of mine, let us give souls to our offspring. Let us plant willows that shall be our memory." Fascinating survival of a local religious tradition, the planting of the willows to preserve the souls, spoken by a man called Juan Bernabe, who's always been baptized with two saint names. And the conflation goes, as you know, on and on. In December of 1531, on the site of an Aztec shrine to a female goddess, the Virgin appeared to the Aztec who had been christened Juan Diego and imprinted her image on his cloak. The clergy didn't like it. The clergy thought this was simply a pretext to go on worshipping the local Aztec goddess, pretending that it had become Christian. But eventually, in the 18th century, in 1737, the Virgin of Guadalupe is proclaimed by the Pope as the patron of Mexico. And this image is a wonderful demonstration of the conflation of Aztec traditions. The eagle on the thorn bush is, of course, an old Aztec legend, and above the eagle on the thorn bush is the Virgin with Juan Diego beside her. And as you know, there are now more pilgrims every year to Guadalupe than there are to the Vatican. These are cultures that were effectively destroyed by European religion and populations that were destroyed by European disease. And that meant a new population had to be brought. And there's one object in the museum that speaks very powerfully of that new population and how it was brought. When the British Museum opened in the 1750s, this was on show as part of the collection of world musical instruments. The idea was to gather things from all over the world that people did in the same thing, did in a different way. And this had been bought in the 1730s in Virginia and was presented as a Native American drum. And it stayed on show from 1759 until about 1900 as Native American drum. At that point, it occurred to a curator to look at it a little more carefully. Our curators are not as fleet of foot as those in Chicago. And it occurred to him that it didn't look a bit like a Native American drum. It did look very, very like an African drum and looked very like the drums used in the chiefs' orchestras on the West African coast. 50 years later, the pace of scholarship is leisurely, one of our curators had the luminous idea of trying to sort out what wood this was made of. And it was discovered, and you know how this is going to end, of course, that it's made of Cordia africana, a wood which is found only in West Africa, and that the cords you can see at the top are also from trees that are found only in West Africa. What we are looking at very clearly is a drum that was once the possession of a West African chief. How on earth did it get to Virginia in the 1730s, when I think there can be no doubt at all that it came with a slave ship. But of course, slaves didn't carry anything, certainly not prestige musical instruments. And this object must be a demonstration of the fact that the people who sold the slaves to the mostly British slave traders were, of course, the West African chiefs who went on slaving raids and sold the slaves to the British to take them to the new plantations where the local population had died because of contact to European disease. It's a very interesting fact that we now know that some of these chiefs sent their sons on the ships so that they could see how the trade worked at the other end. And it's a complicity, if you like, between the two ruling castes, African and British, to exploit the slaves, which was long resisted, but I think is now totally accepted. And Anthony Appiah, the great cultural historian, who's partly Ghanaian, partly British, who now teaches at Harvard, is proud to insist that he has both black and white slave traders in his ancestry, because he comes from the Ghanaian royal family. And this, of course, is, I think, almost certain. It's the purpose of the drum, of the object like this, I think, to complicate the story. Because if ever there were a group of people that had no voice in history, it is, of course, the slaves. And this object gives them a voice. It's what the object can do when there is no text. And why would it be on the ship? Well, the problem with the slave ships, as you know, was that the slaves got very depressed, and many of them jumped overboard, many of them fell ill. And one of the many horrible aspects of the trade was that the slaves were forced to dance. The daily pattern of dancing the slaves as a form of exercise and as a form of antidepressant is well documented. And I think we can imagine that this drum was part of that. When it came to America, the drums were, of course, could be used by the slaves, but eventually they were stopped because the slaves on several occasions used them to start a revolt. And Hans Sloane, the man whose collection is at the basis of the British Museum and who had slaves of his own in Jamaica, tells he had to ban the drums because they were too dangerous. In the 1730s, there was, throughout the plantations in the southern United States, certainly in Virginia, drum bans. And it's probable that this drum was taken out of commission at that point, acquired by somebody for Sloane, and sent back to London. A final twist, which is interesting and again complicates in an uncomfortable way the story. The hide on the top of this drum is American, definitely. And it's cured and prepared in a way that is almost certainly cured and prepared by Native Americans. And of course, we know that Native Americans also had African slaves. They had their own slaves from people they'd captured and conquered in war, and some of them had African slaves. The whole story is less clear-cut, more complicated. Fewer and fewer people come out of it well, except the slaves themselves who survived. And out of this extraordinary, rare object that they were allowed to bring, brought the one thing they could bring from Africa, which of course was their music. This is the oldest known Afro-American musical instrument. And it stands, of course, at the head of everything that Europeans love about America ever since. This wonderful 1950s lithograph by James McConnell. When we were trying to think how we might use this drum to address a wider public, we were, of course, fired up by Bonnie Greer. Bonnie Greer, who is very interestingly herself, of course, descended from slaves, but also has Native American blood. And she was very keen that we put this at the center of the big celebration we had about resistance and remembrance. To commemorate the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade in 2007, we had a major series of events, but focusing on the drum, which Bonnie Greer argued is the typical 20th century, 21st century Londoner. It has connections to 3 continents. The drum has traveled in all the directions. Many of the people have. The Caribbean population in London have followed the same trajectory as the drum. It's part of their history and of our history. And when we had the big public commemoration, and we had about 25,000 people in the museum, with lectures and discussions focused on the drum. I just want to finish with one extraordinary inversion about this question of power over people in America. Elizabeth I, eager to conquer America, to establish Virginia, very unclear how to do it, turns to the leading scientist of the age in England, John Dee. Dr. Dee is a scientist, he's a magician, he has a wonderful combination of Christian and non-Christian contacts. He's in regular touch with angels, and they tell him how to make diagrams which will give him power over the world. The angels come regularly and dictate to him, and they particularly speak to his colleague, Mr. Kelly, Edward Kelly, and this goes on famously until the angels suggest to Edward Kelly that he should have an affair with Dr. Dee's wife, at which point Kelly is dismissed and the angels come only to Dee. But getting in touch with the angels was tricky. And Dee, who is a scientist of real distinction and a scholar, he has the chair of mathematics in Oxford, offered it in Paris, and he is a scholar and a magician. He uses show stones, and one of them is this black polished disc of obsidian. And in this, he conjures spirits. In this, he sees things that are going to happen and accesses the powers of the next world. And this is what allows him to advise Elizabeth on the fishery policies for the Americas and all kinds of other critical parts of imperial expansion. And he publishes the book about the growing British expansion in America, and the book on the art of navigation, all of which he will guide through his showstones. What is fascinating is that this is an Aztec object. This is, without question, an obsidian mirror that would have been used for exactly the same purposes by the Aztec rulers and priests. Obsidian, wonderful, deep, dark, smooth stone, polished with bat excrement to get this wonderful shine, so you can see shadows in it. And Dee almost certainly knew this. He had bought it in the Low Countries, and of course the Spanish connections, the Spanish then ruled the Low Countries. And this takes us back precisely to that assumption of the use of portents, the belief in superstitions, the contact with the other world that led to the downfall, we were told, of Moctezuma. is also used this time by the Europeans to assert their control over the Americans. This object has an extraordinary and disturbing trajectory. And absolutely to finish, power is, of course, what all this was about. How do you exercise power? Who has it? How do they do it? Well, in Europe, it was perfectly clear. You had a divinely ordained sovereign, and that was that. As we know, the United States embarked on a different notion. And what is very striking is the development in the United States of objects that show how power was transferred and spread in a quite different way. And one of the great collections of the museum is objects of this sort. This is a very early example of the medal for the longshoremen of Cleveland, Ohio. Honest work shows a label. It says bravely at the top, where the hands are held together. And it was made effectively as a trade union badge in 1905. And it's the beginning of something extraordinary, because the company that makes this, Whitehead and Hogue, effectively invent the button badge. And this is, of course, a wonderful way of documenting how power is exercised by the people, what it is that people are concerned about. And the development of the button badge and tracing through button badges what's happening in America is one of the ways that the British Museum attempts to do this. Part of the story of America is told through button badges. When Douglas invited me to give this president's lecture, I mistakenly thought it would therefore be appropriate to have this button badge. But I was startled and delighted to discover that actually the president in question is Douglas himself. And we don't yet have a button badge of him. But what is wonderful about this is that it brings us right back to that beginning of the first perception of the inhabitants of America, doing these great, serious ritual things like having an election, producing objects very particular like the button badge, but with an enormous amount of humor and an astonishing diversity of engagement. And this is, I think, the equivalent of John White's paintings of those wonderful Native Americans having the time of their lives, and just apparently being such fun. And I think it's fair that everybody's favorite button badge in the British Museum sums up this astonishing American capacity to invent, to be serious, and to be humorous. Thank you very much. Thank you.